Hi everyone. In this episode of the Miniature Menagerie, we'll be creating custom forest scatter terrain and interchangeable river segments. But without further ado, let's actually get into the video. Welcome to D20 in Disguise. Alright, so before we actually get into the ingredients and what I used to create these forest scatter terrain pieces, I'd like to cover the next few episodes of the Miniature Menagerie and what they'll be covering. In the next 3 episodes of the Miniature Menagerie, I'll be covering different biomes of scatter terrain. Now, this episode is covering forest scatter terrain, as you can see, but the next 3 episodes will be covering 4 different biomes of scatter terrain. So that is definitely something for you guys to look forward to. But without further ado, let's actually get into the ingredients. So as per usual, let's actually go through everything which you're going to need for this actual project. Come on over. Alrighty, so let's start off with the basics. First, you're going to need some cardboard. Quite a lot of it if you're planning to do the river sections, not so much if you're planning to do just the scatter terrain. Now, I suggest getting the round pizza cardboard pieces. Those usually work really well if you're making circular bases for your scatter terrain. Next, I got some gray shades of paint. I personally used a black shade called coal, a darker gray shade called slate, and a metallic shade called sterling, which I got at my local Target. Next, of course, you have to have your Mod Podge. It's the best glue around for this sort of stuff, and I would highly suggest it if you've never used Mod Podge before. Next, I have some tan paint for the detailing for the actual soil. Pretty simple stuff. I'll show you how to detail your stones and your soil later, but let me tell you, it makes the base of your scatter terrain or your river segments. Next, you have all of your powders, all of your grass powders, your flower powders, your stone powders. I personally had 4 different shades of green, one light shade of green, another semi-light shade of green, a darker shade of green, and a very dark shade of green. I have some yellow flowers, and all of those worked really well collectively. Next, you have all of your mosses and different detailers for foliage. Personally, this pack, which I'm showing right here, had some reindeer moss, some bark, some other miscellaneous foliage which you can use. But overall, I was able to get this at my local Michael's craft store, and it worked really well. Next, I had some backup grass powder. Pretty simple. Large amounts of darker bush I had left over from previous projects. This stuff is extremely cheap, and when used well, can really add some nice detailing to your project. Next, because I was a little short on darker green fern plant vine styled foliage, I did decide to buy some from Michael's as well while I was there. It's a small amount, but it did work well and is going to work well for the scatter terrain episodes. Next, I had some simple small river stones, which were extremely useful for the river segments, not so much for the scatter terrain, but definitely for the river segments. If you're going to be doing river segments, separable and interchangeable river segments, highly suggest collecting different sizes of small stones to go on the banks of your river. Now let's move on to the tools you'll actually need for this project. First, you're going to need a box cutter, just a standard box cutter. If it has an extendable blade, that is preferred extremely. I did not have an extendable blade, and the step where I mainly used the box cutter was very tedious and extremely messy. You'll also need some needle nose pliers to actually hold the base of your scatter terrain once the paint's drying, so your fingerprints don't affect the paint. That's pretty important. And if you're really feeling fancy, a magnifying glass would be nice to add the fine, very fine actually, details. I would also suggest a sponge to use to actually add the detailings to your soil and stones, but it's not really necessary. You can use an actual brush. Foam brushes are also an option for putting the base coat on your soil, but once again, brushes will work just fine. As shown here, I have quite a large selection of brushes, but in this project I only used about maybe 5 of them, so you don't need that large of a selection of brushes. Next, I would suggest a large block of styrofoam if you're planning on adding varying levels of terrain in your scatter terrain. Now, some optional tools which you can use are a compass. Now, you would use this compass to actually cut out the bases of your scatter terrain in circles, in ovals. I'll have a link to a video in the description on how to actually create ovals with just a compass. But if you want to go simple, just go with circular bases or just eyeball it. That's fine too. Now, after cutting out all of your bases out of cardboard, that's a pretty simple step. You can make square bases, circular bases, irregular bases. It doesn't really matter. Just think about what kind of style you're going for. Now, once you've actually finished cutting out all your bases and they're all ready to go, here comes the messy part, the styrofoam. You want to take your box cutter, hopefully it's extendable. If it's not, don't worry, it's just a bit messier than it usually be. And you want to cut out lumps, little hills, out of your styrofoam. These lumps and hills you'll eventually glue onto some of the larger bases of your scatter terrain. For example, this base right here, this is quite a large hill actually. And this is completely styrofoam. So you're going to cut out these kind of bases and glue them on top. Now after you've actually glued the styrofoam onto the bases, you want to add some spackle to the edges of the styrofoam just to smooth out the transition from the flat area to the hill. And then you're pretty much done with the base of the actual scatter terrain. Next, you're actually going to want to add your soil base paint. So to do this, I would suggest a much darker tone of brown than you would think. Because once you actually add the highlighting, the lighter tan highlighting to the soil, it really pops if you have a darker tone of soil. Now, you don't have to do this. You can have just a lighter, normal brown for soil. But I would highly suggest actually putting in a bit more detail and having this darker soil and then some nice tan highlighting over it. After painting your base, you're going to want to add the highlighting. Now, this is where the tan paint, which I showed you earlier, comes in. Go ahead and take your brush, dip it in your tan paint, but wipe off all of the excess paint that you can off the brush. This makes it so that only some of the paint sticks to the actual base. And then you're just gonna
It's not funny. It's not funny, okay?
And then you're just gonna wanna wipe that brush lightly across the base. This adds a nice sort of spiderweb feel to the actual highlighting and only highlights the peaks of the actual terrain, which is really nice looking. Now that you have all of your soil, painting, basing, all of that done, you're going to want to actually glue all of your terrain onto the base, such as trees, rocks, anything else which you might want on there, maybe tree stumps, I don't know. Whatever you're going for, whatever theme you're going for with these scatter terrains, this is the time to stick them on there. Now, this piece is a good example of different ways you can attach trees to the actual base. These trees don't actually have a base to them. They're actually stuck into the styrofoam terrain and then glued there with some Mod Podge. And this works very well if you're trying to get a tree on top of a hill or something, so that you don't have to worry about that flat base sticking out. Now after all your glues have been set out and dried, and all of your trees, rocks, stumps, whatever, are finished and glued to your base, you're going to want to detail the stones. Now I would suggest a darker gray base, and using the same method we used to highlight the soil, use a quite lighter tone of gray, and use that method and detail the stones the same exact way. It looks very nice, very stylish, and really turns out well. Now once you have all of your stones detailed, you have your soil, you have all your trees and stumps and anything else attached, now it's time to actually add some grass. This is the time to get all of your grass powders ready. You're going to want to dilute some PVA glue, I would say about half and half. Maybe a little less glue than that, maybe 1 piece glue, 3 pieces water. Just try and find the right mixture to actually allow the grass to stick, but not for the white of the glue to show up. You're going to want to spray all of your bases with that diluted glue, and then go ahead and set down your grass on it. Then, once again taking that diluted PVA glue, you're going to want to spray it on top of all the grass. Now, this method is a nice sandwiching method to get all of your grass layered and glued to the base really well. I didn't really find another good way to do this, but if you have another method to do this, go ahead and share it down in the comments, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Okay, so you have all of your grass done, you have your stones detailed, painted, you have your trees ready. What's next? I would say the next step is bushes and other smaller foliages other than trees. Now, Mod Podge is probably the best to bind the bushes to the actual grass, but you can use whatever glue you want, PVA, Mod Podge, whatever's most convenient to you, but I would highly suggest Mod Podge for this. And after letting all of your glue dry, your pieces are pretty much done. I would highly suggest taking a very diluted amount of glue, let's say 8 pieces water, 1 piece glue, and spraying over all of your bases so that everything is binded to each other and nothing's going to fall off suddenly in play. And there you have it, custom forest scatter terrain. But I also wanted to add another detail which is found commonly in temperate forests, rivers. Detailed interchangeable river segments can add so much detail to a combat encounter, or simply the players just exploring around the world, looking and seeing what's there. You're going to want to start out by cutting out the shape in your cardboard for the actual river segments. Now, I would say definitely make the size, the width of the banks, the same on the pieces which you want to connect to each other. It's just realistic, and if you want them to be even fancier and more interchangeable, you can keep those bank widths the same among many different pieces so they can move wherever you really want them to. Next, you're going to want to cut out all of your banks. This is the same method which we use to cut out the actual hills and terrain and valleys in the scatter terrain. And yes, it is with the messy styrofoam. I made an extremely terrible mess creating all of these banks. They turned out really nicely, but oh my gosh. An extendable blade on your box cutter is an extremely useful thing to have. So I would highly suggest, if you don't have one, investing in it. If you don't, it's fine. You'll just have to clean up a large mess. Here's some actual photos of the mess which I made while creating these banks.
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine, but you just can't get into it because they would never understand.
Yep, pretty bad. Anyway, after finishing your banks, you're going to want to actually paint them. Pretty simple, using the same basing and detailing method which we used for the scatter terrain, with that darker brown base and then the lighter tan detailing, highlighting. It looks really nice, especially on the riverbanks, as you can see here. They look gorgeous. When you're gluing them down, I would definitely suggest hot glue, for a few reasons. Firstly, it dries extremely quickly, so you don't have to worry about accidentally bumping your elbow on one of your pieces and ruining your work and having to glue it all over again. And if it bulges out from under the actual shores, it can look natural if you paint over it again. Next, let's actually move on to the painting of the actual riverbed. I would suggest 3 different tones of gray. One extremely dark tone of gray to go in the center of the river, representing the deepest part of the actual river. Another slightly lighter tone of gray to go outside of that in kind of an intermediate area of the river, not too close to the shore, not too close to the center of the riverbed, just so there's a nice transition between the deepest part of the river and the shallowest part of the river, which should be on the outside, right next to the shores, right adjacent to them, and should be a light tone of gray. Try blending these 3 tones of gray paint together, but if you don't, it's usually covered up by the water. Next, go ahead and take all of your river stones, all of your slightly larger stones, and this is where they really come into play. Go ahead and take Mod Podge, PVA, whatever glue which you really want to use, and go ahead and layer it right next to the shore of the river. And go ahead and pour down all of your small river stones. Kind of moving them around, getting them real situated where you want them to be, and just let it dry. It looks just absolutely beautiful once it's done, and it really adds a lot of detail to the shores, making it feel like a real river. Now, do watch out that you stay consistent between the pieces which interlock with each other, so if there are river stones on one shore of the river and there aren't on the other shore, then that is mimicked in the interlocking piece. So it looks realistic. It isn't just a sudden transition from, oh, all river rocks on this shore to none, because that can look extremely unnatural. After all of that's dried, all of the glue's dried, all of the paint's dried, now it's time to move on to the actual realistic water, which, let me tell you, is a trip. Now, there's a few methods you can actually take when using realistic water. You can buy pre-made realistic water from Woodland Scenics. They sell pretty good stuff. It's extremely expensive though, so be warned. Or you can make your own concoction. You could use a 2-part epoxy and do it that way with some masking tape on the edge of the interlocking pieces. Now, personally, I made my own concoction for realistic water. In this, the main gluing ingredient to actually make the bulging and wavy feeling of water and reflection and all of that is fabric fusion, which is a fabric glue which I learned kind of the hard way in an earlier project, that it binds to pretty much everything. And it actually shares quite a few of the properties of hot glue, but that it doesn't rely on heat and dries a lot slower, but still has that bulge and wave. Now, in case you want to use the actual mixture which I used for my realistic water, let me walk you through the steps I took to create my realistic water. First, I took some dark blue paint and diluted it with some water. I would say about a half and half mixture. Really depends on how clear you want your water to be in the end, but I would suggest a pretty opaque tone of water with a slight change of opacity from average. Next, you're going to want to mix that all together so you have your diluted glue. You're going to want to pour your fabric fusion into another bottle. Pour some of your diluted glue, not too much. You want to still try to maintain the bind and stick of the glue while still painting it and dyeing it with that darker blue tone. Next, you want to prepare your actual river segments for the realistic water. Go ahead and take some masking tape and stick it on the open ends of the river sections so that no realistic water can actually leak out of the river sections, which is a bad thing. You don't want that to happen. And then you're ready to go ahead and pour your realistic water into the actual river segments. I would say let them dry for about 24 hours. It depends on if you're using like Woodland Scenic's realistic water or your own concoction or a 2-part epoxy. But 24 hours is usually the best bet. Now all you have to do is just add some grass powder to the banks of your river. Maybe add a few bushes if you really want it. And your river segments are done. And hopefully looking pretty good. And there you have it. The project is done. Hopefully all of you enjoyed. Thank you for sticking so far into this episode of the Miniature Menagerie. I hope you all enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to hit that like button. And if you're really looking forward to the next 3 episodes, the Miniature Menagerie, covering the different biomes of scatter terrain, go ahead and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. And don't forget to hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of my uploads. Anyway, I hope you all have a great day, keep on creating, and I will see you in the next video.